my exact question was, why is investing a better idea than debt? In the context of like purchases that, like, say you want something nice, say you want to go get a nice water bottle, but you don't have the cash. Why is investing a better idea than just spending the credit debt?
Well, I guess it's all context dependent, right? So like, what are your goals in life? What are your goals? Like, what's the most important aspiration in your life? What is the main thing? And so in this, in the context of this person who wants the nice water bottle, like, what is the main thing? What is their like vision for what they want?
Yeah, I guess they want the water bottle straight away. Like for someone,
if the most important thing, if truly the most important thing for you is immediate gratification, why not?
Well, because they're put into a situation where they've got money owing against their name.
Right. But if their most important thing is immediate gratification, then why not just do more?
That's a great question. Yeah, why not do more? I guess.
mean, there's also you could literally, and I've read novels where this is the payoff. You could literally just throw down one piece of immediate gratification after another, and then just having it be that ultimately, when it truly ran out and you couldn't do it anymore, suicide is the ultimate instant gratification. Right. So you can just kamikaze yourself straight off the planet at just one exhilarating moment at a time, just if you really wanted to.
One at a time.
Yeah.
All right, that's a hectic one, eh? Yeah, I guess I was meaning more in the context of like debt. Not just to buy a water bottle, but like debt overall. Like you hear a lot about good debt and bad debt. Like, do you have thoughts on that? Like, what is good debt and what is bad debt?
I was whipping out my Lafayette College 2007 philosophy minor there. That reminded me of like a like hypothetical you'd get into with like a philosophy professor. But essentially, most people have something that long term either counterbalances or outweighs the immediate term gratification, and so it really truly does depend on what that person is after. Like the Kiwis have that expression that I like, what are you after? And so let's say hypothetically that this person was hoping to retire 5 years early and like retire in a powerful way such that they would never have to like go back into employment if they didn't want to. And let's say that they also had the goal of being able to, as a lot of people aspire to, have enough over the top that they'll be able to leave something of a legacy for their kids and be able to put their kids in a position where they can, as Warren Buffett said, well, like, you leave your kids enough they can do anything, not so much they can do nothing, which a lot of people want to do. Let's say that they have just something like that, and it is decades into the future, but it is like heartfelt and meaningful, and to a degree it is like a personal North Star. If you are then borrowing to serve short-term gratification, you are actively working against those ambitions. And naturally, I guess one way to think about it, I'm sure that there's a billion articles and books that people could read that have covered this, because this is kind of like checkers in the scheme of things, but important is, what is the interest rate on the debt? The higher the interest rate, the more interested you should be on paying it off as soon as possible. And so generally speaking, credit card debt is roughly 23 or 24%. I'm not concerned about somebody's short-term debt. You put money on a credit card, you pay it off this month, and then you get some points that you can use on some other stuff. Like, that's done well. That actually can be like a little bit of an asset to you. But what I'm very concerned about is long-term debt, money you put on a credit card that you then don't pay off, that you're then paying 24% interest on. For context, importantly, Warren Buffett, who is refuted to be the best investor of all time, averaged roughly a 23-24% return. So credit card debt is literally the inverse and the opposite of what Warren Buffett was doing, where he was taking 100K, let's say, and turning it into 123. You're turning 100K into 77 by doing that. And so effectively, by accumulating long-term debt at a 24% interest rate, that is the equivalent of Warren Buffett investing against you and taking money out of your pocket. And so does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think one of the things that like stops a lot of people when they start getting into that kind of stuff, and like I even found myself doing it a little bit, is like a lot of people like have like adverse feelings towards math. Like I hear that and I'm like, boom, there's a bit of math. Like a lot of people are just like thinking, oh, but I want the cool thing. Like what do you have to
I want
say?
the cool thing, but I have to deal with math. Fuck.
Yeah,
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, that is a part of the world in which we live, is that you don't need, I mean, I remember I was in AP geometry when I was in 9th grade. I haven't touched anything resembling that in my adult life. And so anything past, to me, like maybe 7th grade math has been extraneous in adult life. The only exception was when I was in Australia, I accidentally blew out a power socket, and this electrician tradie, as the Kiwis would say, came over, and he was explaining to me like the sine waves. And I hadn't heard the term sine wave since like 12th grade math. And I was like, okay, so there are people out there who needed that, but like I just wasn't one of them. But 7th grade math in this is necessary. Like that level of numeracy is necessary for the same reason that literacy is necessary. And so I would challenge people that if me talking about a 23% interest rate and then that turning 100K into 123 or into 77, if that caused you to contract, I would challenge you to ask yourself the question, like, what do you need to do and who do you need to ask for support so that isn't tripping you up anymore? Because that is a horrific impediment to go through adult life with. And there will be a great deal of opportunity that you'll talk yourself out of subconsciously, I think, if you're afraid of confronting basic numeracy. And I do remember a colleague in the States telling me on pretty strong authority that due to their research, it was something in the neighborhood of most adults in first world countries are afraid of fractions. Numerator over denominator strikes fear into the hearts of most adults in most first world countries, or all first world countries. And that, in my opinion, plays a disproportionate role in explaining why inequality has ballooned to where it is. And so whatever it is that we can do to prevent that from happening in the school system, but then also to exercise cure in adulthood life, where if anybody listening to this, like how many hours in the last month did you spend accumulating information on any number of things? Could you just give a little bit of that time to just plugging that 4th grade math problem so that it isn't costing you dearly? And I say that with like sub-zero condescension and just like genuine concern, because if I was like sneakily sort of like introvertedly intimidated every time that a check came to the table and I had to calculate a 20% tip, that would be a real problem. And that would cause me to trust people with things that I don't think any human should be trusted with other than yourself.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think about hearing that, it all makes perfect sense to me, like hearing the stuff around like how it strikes fear into people's hearts. At one point in time, it definitely did to mine. I think when it comes to a lot of people that come from like generations of debt, if that makes sense. Like I feel like a lot of people come from there. Like, would you have anything to say to people that say had never been in credit in any way financially in their life, like intergenerationally? Like say like your parents were in debt and their grandparents were in debt. Like why should they trust investing over debt?
Well, I think it's really important to, as I was saying, like interest rate is a major aspect in this. Personally, I find it to be much more peaceful to have my liability column say 0 and to have no debt at all. But at the same time, interest rate is supremely relevant because it is very different to be paying 24% on credit card debt, or maybe like, let's say like 5% on a mortgage, or 0.5% or 0% on student loans. Those are very different problems or predicaments to be in. And so it depends on what you're saying in terms of generations of debt. I think it's fair to say that most people in most cultures, certainly New Zealand culture, the expectation is to the second that you can make enough and invest enough that you can get a mortgage, then that's what you should do. You should get on the property ladder as soon as possible by any means necessary. It is important to point out in context that mortgage is a French word that means death pledge. If you just take a second and just internalize what that actually means, that's an issue. And so is this mortgage, is this death pledge something that is actually genuinely in like my and my family's best interest, is an important question that you need to ask before you go into that, and that you should be asking, in my opinion, independently of social expectations, paternalistic expectations, and all the rest of it. Because I'm sure there's many examples that we could point to of like a very intelligent mortgage and a very unintelligent mortgage. And those would be, but it's just kind of a subjective thing. But at the same time, there is a difference between smart debt and dumb debt. And there are factors that you need to be aware of and decisions and micro decisions that you need to make independently that would dictate whether it's smart or dumb debt for you.
Mm. Yeah. Would you say, like, in the instance of it being like a bad mortgage, so to speak, a lot of the time that would just be that the margin between their income each week and their outgoings each week is like very small, and there's not much left to play with?
Well, that's something.
Like, when does it go from being bad, like a bad mortgage, to a good mortgage? Is, I guess, what I'm asking.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, as someone who doesn't have a mortgage and might never have a mortgage, I have my own personal opinion on that I don't think that anyone necessarily needs to share with me. Aside from the fact that I have a personal philosophy that is carefully considered and that I'm true to, that I'm willing to like expand and adapt as time goes by, as I learn more and as my needs and wants change. But for me, I think it's fair to say that there's a reason that banks are really wanting to offer these things to you, which is that it's probably in their best interest more so than yours. But for me, one thing to consider would be, 2022, I went and I was in Auckland, and I was there to do a couple of podcasts on the New Zealand Everyday Investor, with the great Darcy Ungaro. And I remember vividly I had breakfast in Ponsonby, and then I went and bought a bottle of water, and then got my hair cut, and then did the podcast. At least 3 people unsolicited were talking about their interest rates. They're like floating interest rates and their mortgages. And I'm like, well, this is almost certainly what a bubble sounds like. I was like, dear Lord. And so like when you're in a spot like that where you're saying what everybody else is saying, you've probably found yourself in a bad spot where you can't afford to service the death pledge. And obviously that strikes me like a situation that you don't want to be in. I think my personal perspective is, as long as that debt feels like a drop in the bucket that you could pay off under your own power predictably, but you choose not to because you see how borrowing that money up front creates opportunity for you to capitalize, that makes sense. But if it feels like it's not a drop in the bucket, and that if due to factors beyond your control, the interest rates floated up a little bit, and all of a sudden now you need to go get a second or third job that you don't want to service that debt, you have played into the hands of people that don't care about you.
In our first practice pod, you kind of outlined your rough experience leading into investing through your dad and his understandings on Wall Street. You mentioned a bubble there, like your experience in Ponsonby, and you're like wandering around and like you're like, this sounds like a bubble. I don't think many people could intuitively pick out what a bubble is, nor understand what a bubble is. Could you explain that for people that are like just tuning into like what investing actually is?
Oh, sure. So the guy who created the 80-20 principle, which is like a famous business principle, Vilfredo Pareto, had a good line about this where he basically said there is a predictable rhythm of sentiment. And he said, you can Google that and get the full quote. But essentially, I took away predictable rhythm of sentiment as being a really strong and lucid explanation of this, where you see it with any company, any commodity, any currency. There is always a pendulum that is swinging from, we could say, hysteria to euphoria. And while I'm quoting people, I'll also say the most interesting quote that I've read about investing was this guy, Sir John Templeton, who popularized investing outside of the borders of your own country, who said that bull markets are born on pessimism, rise on skepticism, mature on optimism, and die on euphoria. Therefore, the moment of maximum pessimism is the best time to buy, and the moment of maximum optimism is the best time to sell. I 95% agree with that assessment. And to me, it paints a really good picture of the predictable rhythm of sentiments milestones. And so essentially you have a pendulum that is swinging at all times from euphoria to hysteria or vice versa. Very seldomly is it at either place. But when it reaches euphoria for anything, and the first thing was tulips. Like you could buy a tulip you could sell a tulip for the same amount that you could like buy a house at a certain time. And you've seen it essentially when you hop into an Uber, you hop into 5 Ubers and 4 of the Uber drivers tell you that you need to buy Bitcoin, AI stocks, whatever the case may be. The second that people that would otherwise never have an opinion are telling you what you need to do, you're probably at euphoria. And when people refuse to talk about something or refuse to talk about any like micro aspect of positivity, they're just screaming about it psychologically, and it's like just 100% unnuanced cynicism, you're probably in hysteria. And so as someone who's been investing for a while and has been like savvy to helping other people start and being aware of these patterns, if you keep an ear out, you can directionally ballpark any, like I said, company, commodity, currency, where it is on the hysteria to euphoria pendulum. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes heaps of sense. And I was thinking about quite a few different things, like funnily enough, music. Like I feel like the drift between like hysteria and euphoria, it happens with like different genres. It's almost like a human nature thing, would you say? Like, I guess it drives it, right? Like
human nature is the only thing that drives it.
Yeah.
It is the and that's where a lot of people get really tripped up, I think, by how investing actually works, where if you sit and think about it for too long, you can turn it into, hypothetically speaking, like a math problem. It should be perfectly efficient and operate at all times by these tenets. But essentially, like, the market is the total sum of human opinions on in the moment on any one thing, and therefore subject to massive illogic, massive chaos, and massive unpredictability. And so that's like, there's predictable rhythms of sentiment, but you don't know where the gradient is going to be at any one moment it's essentially impossible. I think it's fair to say. Yeah.
I guess the only predictable element would be just that things will change. Like just the entropy is just going to keep doing its thing and things are going to keep changing, right?
There will, and that eventually there's going to be euphoria, and eventually there's going to be hysteria. You can't set your watch by it, but when it happens, it's helpful to be aware that it's happening.
Yeah. In the test podcast, we went through a lot of, I guess, your like childhood and how you came to investing. At what stage of your life did you become aware of like how bubbles worked?
That's interesting. Honestly, I've never really thought too much about the term bubble, even though it's an aquatic term. I think that, I guess I've always thought about it in terms of hysteria and euphoria. There is a term that I use with my workshop clients, and that I was using sort of with an old friend, and then as like an internal joke, the concept of Joey Public, which would be essentially like the Homer Simpson or like the Randy Marsh of investing, like the average dumbass. And so those quotes are actually 2 good examples, but there's a billion others amongst like the investors and writers that I've been studying since forever, where there's a tremendous amount of disdain from sort of like intellectual elites about what the average person is doing, particularly under stress and particularly when part of like a torch wielding mob. And so I've always been thinking about it for a really long time in the context of like, what would Joey Public do? Because generally speaking, mob, like as the great George Carlin said, never underestimate the power of stupid people in large groups. It's not that the people are stupid, but the groupthink makes them stupid. And so that is what is driving the euphoria and the hysteria. And I think that being a focus investor in stocks and then reading the literature, much more than like the technical strategies of how to do it, like much more what popped out at me through the experience of doing it and then analyzing it through the prism of helping other people is the, honestly, like mostly the lack of, but then like the few examples of trenchant statements about how the human element shows up in investing.
So it was more through educating people that you started to see the patterns of like how bubbles popped up than like intuitive, like, or then picking it up through your childhood.
I think honestly the biggest thing is when you've got serious skin in the game. So like I'm anti-diversification within reason and pro focus investing. So having as few investments as possible, and being with them for the long term, as long as their like fundamentals hold up. For me, like when you do that, one of the major benefits of it is that you're paying attention. You're not burying your head in the sand. You're not being neurotic about it, but you're not oblivious either. Because like, let's say that 40% of your net worth, let's say just as a hypothetical, was in an investment. You're probably paying attention to what the world is saying about that investment. And you're probably paying attention to your own like mental chatter about how you're reacting to what the rest of the world is saying about it. And so for me, I'm almost certainly like these clarities were forged in primarily in the crucible of being an active investor, but then helping other people do this and sort of stepping in and doing spot research when you feel like there's a hole in your game that should be filled. I think that it also contributes, but I think the main thing is being participatory, I would say.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, in terms of like property market specifically, like how do you think that plays out? Like obviously 2022, we're kind of like going through a big period of, or beginning to go through a big period of inflation in New Zealand, like banks put the interest rates up. As it plays out, did you kind of see all of that coming? Like understanding bubbles and like loosely understanding like the media in New Zealand, like, and how things were going to play out with the interest rates from the central bank?
Oh, I would definitely not claim. I definitely would not claim credit for that. For me, it was one of those things where, I mean, there's a couple of things there. First of all, I want to make really clear my area of extreme experience and extreme specialty it's very narrow. It is focus investing in aggressive assets, which are stocks in companies that are attached to products and services that probably you use a lot. I'm not a super specialist in a lot of defensive matters, including debt, mortgages, and I'm not anti-real estate, but I don't view that as something that is going to be a needle-moving investment for me or for other people, for reasons that if you look at the scoreboard of who's making the most money and multiplying the most money, it should be pretty obvious. But so for me, this is not my area. But however, the patterns cross over. And so, for example, the same patterns that or criteria that would make something a good investment in the stock market almost certainly apples to apples would cross over to any asset, any commodity, any currency. And similarly, the patterns that would imply if this was a particularly good time to buy or hold or sell almost certainly also crosses over to any other asset class. At the same time, I do want to give the proviso that that's not my area. Generally speaking, though, yeah, like when going around New Zealand and Australia and observing through hundreds and hundreds of conversations that the so-called American dream of getting the mortgage, the death pledge by any means necessary as soon as possible is actually quite magnified here, even more so here than it is in Australia. No, well, Australia is neck and neck, much more so than in the US. That was obvious. And so it did beg the question where it's like, and then you talk to other people that are more on the contrarian side and they're like, yeah, like we're not like producing value anymore. We're just like clutching physical property. And so I'm like, yeah, like obviously this is going to come to a head at some point. But and it was obvious when I was walking around Auckland in June 2022 that like shit was hitting the fan. But the thing is, and this is where the perception pendulum that I was talking about can be really hard to read. Sometimes sort of what you think is hysteria is actually just getting started. It's just merely pessimism. It's like the hysteria ain't even gotten started yet. And sometimes euphoria, it seems like euphoria, but it isn't. It's just optimism that is going to extend into a over the top way. And so like the actual like peak of euphoria or hysteria is, it can come a long time after the initial noises. So that's one thing about it that can make it a little bit harder to read. And I think it is quite modesty inducing because anyone who tells you that they can definitely call the top or the bottom of every asset class all the time is just essentially delusional.
Yeah, no one's a genie, eh?
Yeah, I mean, even a genie by definition would only be able to do that for you 3 times.
Yeah. No, for sure. Yeah, I think hearing all of that, one of the things that kind of like rung through my mind is like, ever since I met you at the shop, like cutting your hair and stuff, I think understanding the way that you look at property in New Zealand influenced me in a massive way. But ever since I was young, I never really looked at like $1 million house in Auckland and thought, man, $1 million, that's so worth that. What are your thoughts on like the future of that in New Zealand? Do you think we're just getting started, or
in like the long-term future of real estate in New Zealand?
Yeah.
Honestly, I wouldn't presume to have an opinion.
Yeah.
I just don't think that it's going to be anywhere near as like explosive or prosperous as other places that you could put your money.
Yeah.
And that's not a knock on New Zealand. It's a knock on real estate as an asset class.
Yeah. In terms of like asset performance, I think that's something that I was introduced to through yourself. And like growing up in New Zealand, houses are kind of like the only thing that anyone's thinking about in terms of making a serious transaction. At least at like a high school level, you don't hear anyone about like talking about like cracking it in business or like anything like that. And if you do, I don't know, I didn't, but like it would just seem so outside the ordinary. It would be like a shock, and you'd be like inclined not to trust it. What are your thoughts on like asset performance, focus investing in stocks compared to a house? Because like a house, like in a bull market, you're probably like cutting it close to what like a high performing stock would, right? Or like how does that work? Like which performs better and like when?
So, well, I mean, if you're doing a poor job of picking stocks, you'd be much better off putting your money in cash, real estate, and some kind of diversified thing. But if you're doing a good job, and if you are able to predictably do a good job, it begs the question of why you would be doing anything else other than the bare minimum of keeping yourself safe and stable. Again, and that is heavily debatable and subject to change based on your needs and wants and the people that depend on you and so on. But I mean, essentially, you're not going to find like a real estate investment is what? It is a piece of land, a constructed home, and then a neighborhood, and like the perception of the future of the value of that neighborhood. That is never going to grow and transform at the same rate in reality, and then consequently in perception, as like the best businesses and services in the world that can grow at a global scale in ways that we can't even, that like literally will blow our minds as the years go by about how they're changing things in the world. It's just, those are incomparable things. I think the only exception would be if you had access to like oligarchic levels of money and political connections that you could start sort of like buying entire neighborhoods and then popularizing the neighborhood. that, as was done in pockets of Brooklyn, New York, let's say, over the last like 15, 20 years, unless you're doing that, it's completely incomparable. Because that's, I guess what I'm getting at is like, if you're not investing in a tectonic transformation, then why would there be a big financial shift? You're just kind of investing in an incremental shift. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. In terms of like the Brooklyn example, right? Like Brooklyn used to be the hood. Has it like just fully become gentrified? Like, is that kind of like the situation over there, or?
I mean, for context, actually, I'm wearing white shorts now too. What do you know? I remember I was walking through. It's like, have you ever heard of Harlem?
Yeah.
So Harlem at a certain point became rebranded as Central Park North, and like Bushwick started getting rebranded as East Williamsburg, and all of a sudden Williamsburg, which at one time was in like the 70s or 80s maybe, like was the hood, it was a very dangerous place to be, becomes more posh than Manhattan. It's like, oh, you can go work in the city after this like quaint, beautiful little like train ride in, like completely shift it. And so I call it Manhattan Fest Destiny for any Manifest Destiny nerds out there. But in essence, yes. And I remember I participated in this to a degree where I got an apartment in East Williamsburg, which used to be Bushwick. And I was walking from my apartment to the train to go into the city. And I remember this guy yelled from his porch. He's like, "My rent is fucked." Like, and I looked down at myself in my white shorts and I'm like, "Sorry, man. Like, I don't know how to help you out with this." And that was 10, 15 years ago. And so it would be much more dramatic now. And, yeah, that's how things go sometimes. But even that I'm not a real estate expert, but the real money would have been made in initially architecting that versus participating in it once it became obvious enough to somebody like me who notices it just walking down the street. If you had anticipated it and then, importantly, which is why I use the word oligarchic, like funded it politically, financially, and galvanized it, that, in my opinion, is like the only way that you would find an investment return that was tantamount to investing, let's say, in like Amazon, when people were saying that it was a hypothetical and it probably wasn't going to work out, and that the internet itself was probably a fad. And even then Amazon would have blown that investment out of the water, which is, I think, one of the beautiful democratizing elements of being able to invest, where if you back something that you see is going to flourish, you can put your money in a place where it would be very difficult to find better odds.
Something I've thought about since I met you is just like the general profitability of investing in single companies. Like, I remember when I met you and you explained what you did, I remember like going into Sharesies and like looking at like all of these companies that had just seen insane growth over like 5 years or a year, and just like thinking, man, that would be mean to know 5 years before. Something I thought about before this, do you think there's a more profitable passively growing asset than investing in a company? Like, well, possibly? Like,
well, I think
like a winning company. Like,
I guess it
like
depends on what time horizon, and like, to me, the classic book on value investing by Benjamin Graham, The Intelligent Investor, he spent almost the entire book doing something really interesting. If you're reading between the lines, which, to be frank, almost no one does when they read that book, they're just looking to like fill in a couple of very specific info gaps, and that's it. But if you actually look at it from a slightly bigger picture, he runs you through every sort of piece of discourse, simultaneously saying that this applies to the best system of investing in the world right now, which is value investing. But then he also left open the door that maybe on a long enough time horizon, this like aggressive investing could overtake it. And there's a lot of brilliance in that, where he was able to, first of all, understand and diagnose what was the most effective system in the world, which Warren Buffett used to become Warren Buffett, while simultaneously anticipating what was potentially, I don't think he ever said probably, but like potentially going to happen in the future, which is essentially anticipating the difference between sizing up a company that sells a product in a store versus the way that you would size up a company that sells an idea in a cloud. And so if you were to read that book all the way through, you'd get a pretty good understanding of why aggressive shit. What were we talking about? Sorry, I blacked out.
Well, like, yeah, I guess I was like kind of like just understanding, like looking to understand, like in terms of asset classes, why, or like what would work better passively? Like, is there a possible like passive asset that could grow better than a company could?
Right. So what I was getting at with the intelligent investor thing was he anticipated he understood and diagnosed what was best right now while anticipating what might become the best in the future. There needs to be some due modesty about how things can change. But, over the last very long time, I think you could easily say more than 100 years, stocks have been the most important, most successful thing, which is, of course, not the stock itself, day trading it, but investing in the long-term future of transformative companies. Maybe something else can overtake it. Certainly, like Bitcoin and crypto evangelists would tell you that that's that, and like, gold bugs could make an argument there. But essentially, there is a chance that something else at any given moment in time could be more successful. But on average, I believe that long-term focused contrarian in companies is likely to be the most relevant and the most successful, for reasons that are very obvious when you start looking at who is the most, how people are self-liberating and how people are becoming the most wealthy people in the world. And then who's doing that in microcosm just to solve the problems of like their little lifestyle. I think that's pretty obvious. At the same time, we live in a very dynamic time, and there is a chance that could apply to something else. And the same principles, it is important to understand, can translate apples to apples to those commodities, those currencies, or what have you.
Do you have many thoughts on why it's not more popular?
Investing in shares.
Yeah.
As opposed to real estate.
As opposed to anything. Because like I think like I understand after like talking with you like for hours on end, it's practical, it works. Why do you think more people don't know about it?
I think everyone knows about it.
Yeah.
I think that there's a psychological thing and there's a strategy thing. And then there's a psychological thing as a result of not having a strategy thing. And so I think if you didn't have a good strategy about going about it, that would be paralyzing. I think if you didn't have any examples in your day-to-day life of someone that's just you consider to be a normal person who's done it well, that would be a paralyzing thing. And then I also think that most people gravitate towards the tangible. It's like, what can you actually gather sensory data on? And I think that's a big reason why when people get really scared, they want to like hoard gold and guns and like bury it and like sit on it and protect it. We become very tactile. And so these like invisible things are frightening to most people. And I think that can be an element that precludes their participation unless and until it's properly demystified, which is, I've heard it enough times that it's starting to feel like a trite word, but it's a very important concept where it no longer feels like a mystery because you have experience that makes it tangible that you can point to. I think that's the major thing. I suppose, long story short, it's the lack of experience that is coming from the lack of someone or something helping people start in a meaningful way. Yeah.
I definitely think like the tangibility of the situation when it comes to like growing your assets or your portfolio in any way is such a massive factor. Like I think about that with yourself. For myself, like I wouldn't trust it if I hadn't met you. But it's interesting, as soon as I like started to speak a bit of the language, like, had the financial literacy and the wherewithal to like speak with like other people in the barbershop about it. It's interesting how many people have made money in shares, but just no one wants to talk about it for some reason, even if they won big. Like there's a lot of people in Wellington that won off of zero. Like I think they're like almost at $200 NZ. They started like in Wellington like for dollars, like low dollars, and people are like retired, you know, and cruising and doing whatever they want to do, but no one's going to tell you about it, because I feel like there's like this like, I don't know, this negative like outlook on people that have that ability. It's really interesting to think about.
That had the ability to invest in zero?
Well, that had the ability to retire off of it, you know?
Which is so interesting, because why, if that's what everyone wants and then somebody gets it by, let's keep it Wellington centric, by investing in a company that is right in the center of everything, why would that inspire bad feelings? And then why would that inspire shame? Like, what is that about?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I've thought about it heaps, and I think a lot of it just comes down to like envy, but like envy where you're not going to do anything about it.
Yes.
It's like, and it's interesting because like no one really wants to talk about it, but I think it's like a big part of our culture here, and I'm sure you would have noticed since you moved there.
I think it applies to human nature everywhere. Yeah. And I do think that certain like tribal campfires magnify it and make it even worse. They like stoke the sort of human foibles to the extreme in certain ways. And that's just really, really sad, because it keeps people from, I don't know, sharing a win that then is good feedback for other people to get in the game and then change something. That is, I just thought of a very dark example, but like to me, like that kind of thing, like the tall poppy thing where you strike anyone down that has a win, and then everyone just kind of like huddles into themselves, and you're not allowed to talk about either your wins or your losses or your fears or your whatever. Like, how is that not just like being a circus of emotional midgets? And like, how is that not directly related to the sky high suicide rate? I hate to say, you know, that because it creates a pressure cooker with no outlet, and that's not good. That's just comprehensively bad.
Yeah. One of the local comedians, actually, Joe Damond, he like just jumped on a different podcast, and he mentioned that he personally believes the suicide rate a lot, and like mental health in general, comes down to the lack of ability to express yourself for men especially. So that perfectly aligns with what you're saying. And like his whole point is like, oh well, you know, if you're at like a drinks and you like put on like a Kylie Minogue song, everyone would look at you and be like, what the fuck is that, bro? Like, you know, you can't do that. Or you, like, there's all of these like kind of constraints on how you can like even like exist. And I think that's very intense here for sure.
Constraints on how you can exist is a good way to say it. Very good way to say it. And I do think that men are doing that to each other all over the world through all of recorded history. And I think that's a damn shame. And I think that figuring out, and honestly, that it kind of comes to the whole thing is like when people talk about, and it goes to the perception pendulum and everything else, is that when people talk about money, they think mostly it's like numerator over denominator, stock charts, PE ratios, jargon they don't understand. But mostly it is human illogic, and like being able to, first of all, understand and see and deal with your own illogic, and then also being able to either understand and just let live or capitalize off of the illogic of other people. And again, if you look at the global scoreboard, there's only a few people that are dialed in, and they are doing that in a very greedy capacity, a very rapacious capacity all over the world. And and it's essentially a couple people that are just raping and pillaging every which way, and then a bunch of people that like aren't allowed to talk about their feelings, and then are like committing hara-kiri in various ways. And so like psychologically speaking, you've got sultans that are free expressing their asses off, and slaves who are playing this big. And like a lack of emotional intelligence intracranially, but then socially, is at the core of all of this.
Yeah, that's something I thought about extensively, like the sultans and slaves dynamic psychologically, mainly because like I feel like growing up in New Zealand, like with all of the constraints that we just mentioned, it like really like made me want to express myself and like do something. And I think a lot of people feel confined by it. But it's interesting. You mentioned like slaves. Like I remember like looking into the history of like the colonization of Wellington City, and like Edward Gibbon Wakefield, like Karl Marx was like, you know, like wrote all about him, and like just like his negative thoughts on him as a like he also like colonized Canada, and part of like his literature on like how to colonize systematically was pretty much saying people don't like being slaves, so we'll just make them economic slaves.
Yep.
And it's just like, well, it's literally in writing, bro. Like that's like the root of the country. Like, I don't know.
I remember I read some meme randomly where it was like, why didn't we structure this so we could just hang out and eat fruit? Like, why did we do this?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, this was architected. All of this was architected. And it can be like reverse architected, but not without, because as anybody knows, it is much easier to do something than to undo something. And it is much easier to learn something than to unlearn something. It is a huge ask for an entire society or an entire like global civilization to like unlearn something and pivot. But essentially, like if we're really trying to create a different world order, which I think a tool like investing definitely does make possible, entrepreneurship and investing can definitely play a huge and disproportionate role in making that happen. But it is a huge ask, but 99.5% of that ask is an EQ, emotional intelligence ask, not an IQ ask, which makes it even harder considering that where is emotional intelligence being trained or even incentivized for? And so like that part of the architecture was blunting people's emotional education and critical thinking abilities, and then self-expression abilities where you're compressing each other, like don't stand out. So we are in one, if you really think about it at that level, we are in like one hell of a Gordian knot. And it is interesting to consider, also very important to consider how we can start to sort of loosen it and undo it.
Yeah, the knot's tight for sure. And I'm sure a lot of people are feeling it right now. Something that I'm kind of like thinking, listening to all of this, it feels like it makes a lot of sense to me, having like thought through it so much and so often. But for anyone that this resonates with, that feels constrained, that feels like they're paralyzed essentially, what are your thoughts on like first steps? You know, if they're in an environment where like nothing's really making sense, they can't put Kylie Minogue on at the drinks, or they can't escape the trap of a 9-to-5 or even like hope to. What do you think's the first step for investors, like people that want to kind of like find some degree of economic freedom?
Yeah, I think I'm thinking of a conversation I had a long time ago with a Wellington VIP, Nat Ferguson, who co-founded Hatch, where our conversations about money would of course sprawl off into the human element more often than not for exactly these reasons. And I remember she said something along the lines, had crystallized it to like how you get better as an investor is how you get better in a relationship, is how you get better anywhere. It is, you need to dial in your self-awareness, and then you need to dial in your communication of that self-awareness. And so, you know, salvation lies within. It probably sounds like woo-woo crap to the average person who'd be like, you're not allowed to listen to Kylie Minogue. but essentially start journaling, start recognizing patterns and be like, what do I actually want? And where am I holding myself back in a way that I don't want to? Where am I feeling constrained in a way that I actually really don't want to? And so I actually took a bit of a step back from running full tilt in coaching, investing for a little bit to make sure that I was congruent with what I was doing. And like one of the sort of ways to make sure that my inner poet is on board and is actually directing my general that's telling me that I'm not allowed to listen to Kylie Minogue or whatever, it's actually coming from the poet, is the directions, is my inner decision chamber is simplified to, do I want this? Fuck yes, no, or fuck no. And the important distinction there to me, because a lot of people have heard like fuck yes or no. Fuck yes is obvious. Fuck no is obvious. What's not obvious is that the average thing is probably going to fall into no. And so where are the areas where you are fuck yes and you're not actually acting that way? And if that's listening to Kylie Minogue in the bar, that's your prerogative. If that's learning how to dance as a man, that's your prerogative. If that's learning how to fist fight as a woman, your prerogative. But essentially, like, who is the you that you want to be? And like the trajectory that you're currently on, is it serving that? And then in the context of that, and like visualizing what you're currently tolerating and suffering under that you don't want to be suffering under anymore, what are you going to slide into if you don't do something about it? And what and who can you become and be for the other people that you care about if you do make adjustments? And then by getting really, really clear about what I think of as like point A, point B, and point C, that will be very illuminating. But it starts there, because what do you want investing to do for you if you're not clear on those things? Like, let's say that you take $1,000 and invest it into something that quickly turns the 1,000 into 3. Okay, now what? Like, what is the next thing? Like, if you don't have a North Star, like, how do you even know how to pivot? And so, in my opinion, it starts with self-awareness. And then the second thing is, it also does start with momentum, which is, from where I'm sitting, everybody should have a cash shield that is 10K or more. Not even for the sake of the money itself, for the sake of the peace of mind and the clarity of thought that comes from having a bigger cash position. And if you build a 10K cash shield and you're still a nervous wreck, then get it to 20. But like, everybody should have enough in cash that if they had started having heart palpitations and they needed to like take a personal day, that this wouldn't be something that would ruin them. And that is a level of stress that almost everyone is living under now. And I think that needs to be solved internally first, defensively speaking. And then, of course, you need to make sure that you're making more than you're spending, and then flowing that money over to build that. And then basically buying one share of one company that sells a product that you believe in. And the question that I ask people that helps them begin, 2 questions. One is, what is keeping you from buying one share of one company within the next 30 minutes? If that is a fuck yes thing for you. And then the second thing is, if you're interested in doing that, what is a company that sells products to consumers and a stock to investors that you are simultaneously experienced with in the past, engaged with / addicted to in the present, and intrigued by for the future? I'm not asking you, or in any way saying that you should bet the farm or anything like this, but like, if you were to invest and buy one share of that company, or using fractional investing, which are like a lot of these brokerages let you do now, you could buy a fraction of it, not even one share, for X amount. But if you just got a bit of skin in the game and held for a year, and now you were an investor that had a year of experience, a year from today, would that not help you more than sitting around and like analyzing and spending $1,000 on like Kindle books that you beautifully highlighted but did nothing with? Like, wouldn't that be better for you? And so to me, ultimately, that's what I would recommend. It's self-awareness, setting up your defensive infrastructure, and then experimenting with offense. And once you've ticked those boxes, if you're ready to continue moving forward and it isn't obvious, then asking for support. But I think that in the beginning is what everyone really on planet Earth should be doing. And a major important function of the one share of one company is that you're then going to have in a year's worth of data, both emotionally and mathematically, about whether this felt better and or performed better than your other assets, which is vital, because otherwise it's just hypothetical.
Yeah, that's an epic piece, I think, on self-awareness. Obviously, all of the technical stuff is going to be super valuable for anyone that hasn't started yet. But the piece around self-awareness, I think, is massive, because most people, like, understanding that you can succeed in the stock market, also haven't had someone tell them that it's okay to like look into what you want.
Yeah, well, this is only being done in the context of what you want, because why else would you be doing it? Because that's what other people are doing. Like, it's purely in the context of what you want for yourself, for your family, and for your community. And for some people, it begins and stops at self, which I guess is fine. But like, it's the first thing, because without the to me, I guess one challenge for anybody listening to this now or later would be if somebody looked at you like when you were sharing some thought and I was like, oh, that's nice. What's your purpose? You could answer the question and you wouldn't just be like, like if you can answer that, then you're in a much better spot to make the right decisions than if you're caught flat-footed.
Yeah, it definitely takes like many hours of introspection, days, even weeks and months, right, to even start answering that question. I think it's something that can evolve as well.
Actually, I would want to pause that just because I don't want to throw that up as a deterrent to people.
Yeah.
I believe that if you challenge yourself to create a first draft of your answer to that question in 30 minutes on one side of one piece of paper, and you limit yourself to 30 minutes, you can like drink a coffee and walk around the block and then do it. But as soon as possible, within 30 minutes, one side of one piece of paper, you can probably get the lion's share of the way there. And then you're tweaking. But I don't think it takes you months to be able to answer that unless you're like 12. I think by the time you're like 14, 15 years old, a lot of them would be able to do that too.
Yeah. I don't know. I think I'm coming at it from an angle of people that are like kind of stuck emotionally. I think there's a lot of people that have a lot of things to break down. But I think if people are like ready to like, start making progress, especially with respect to like investing, right? Like you need to like change a lot to have that degree of confidence. And people that are like already committed to becoming an investor, like truly would do that. But I think when people are like learning to trust it, I don't know, like for instance, for myself, like when I first met you, it took like months before I bought my first stock and it was a bubble in a pot. And so it's like all of these like layers, right? But I think for me, it did take months, but everyone's different, right? I definitely agree. If someone was really dead set on actually making it happen, it wouldn't take long, but not everyone's there, right?
That's true.
Yeah.
That's a good point. I just don't want to aid and abet procrastination because when people are scared, they will lean into rationalization and excuses and find ways to make these nonsense sound virtuous. And so, the most that I can do to like strip it down, make it simple, make it actionable, make it fast, band-aid it, the better. But I agree. I mean, some people, for a variety of reasons, aren't ready to feel realized, but they are ready to start. And I think that's the thing. Like, I love this book called The Now Habit, which is about how to battle procrastination. And like as Stephen Pressfield wrote in the book, The War of Art, like how to battle resistance. And one of the things is to think about it never in terms of finishing, but just as starting. And all you got to do is just start one more time for 30 minutes. And if you can just have that be where you're just starting one more time for 30 minutes, whether you're visualizing end game or just taking the next action, if you just think about it like that, it chunks it down enough that you can actually start doing stuff versus feeling like you need to like write the word, like fill up a notebook like this with like the world's best declaration before you can begin kind of a thing. That is it's a very enticing and like noble sounding, but nonetheless like destructive trap that I want to keep people away from, because the amount of just naked nonsense that people have thrown trying to make it sound virtuous just to get permission from someone like me to stay where they are in the hole that they're in is just, the versatility of it is really like amazing.
Yeah, people can get creative with that kind of stuff, huh?
Oh my God. It's pretty amazing, but they know it. And that's why when the people who ask for help, what they're really asking for is like, hold me accountable and don't let me help me grow into like the superhero version of myself that I have in my mind when I watch the climaxes of the movie. Like, that's me doing that. Like, help me become that person. Like, don't let me play small anymore. But it is fascinating when people like ask you for that, but then back down and like just clamp back down. Yeah. What it sounds like, what it looks like. But yeah, whatever I can do to help people sort of get the momentum and then see it through is what, that's what Fine Fat Fish really is.
That's epic.